During the early morning hours of December 7, 1941, a flock of Japanese aircrafts besieged Pearl Harbor by command of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Every warbird belonging to the United States was ablaze and could never again be flown. The attack was impactful, but the Japanese target was the battleships. All ships were damaged, and the USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, and the USS Utah sunk to the bottom of the harbor. Yamamoto argued that the attack would give a fatal blow to the enemy fleet. 1,177 crewmen died that day. December 7th would be known as a day of infamy. Against his morals and his wife's strong opinion, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19th of the next year, which immediately authorized the imprisonment of all Japanese Americans. President Roosevelt was not happy with the decision, but it was a time of national crisis, and it was thought to be the only option. Though America was afraid, Japanese Americans should not have been thrown into internment camps, fenced in, rattled, and disheartened for years. While President Roosevelt felt unsettled by the executive order, almost every one of the Japanese Americans were innocent, and none were tried for spying before being trapped behind barbed wires, making them victims of remarkably unfair racial profiling. Soon after the ratification of Executive Order 9066, posters dictating the relocation were made public, taped on every main street in the United States. Not long after, the Federal Bureau of Investigation aggressively knocked on doors and forced Japanese citizens to vacate their homes and businesses, heading to the nearest camp or relocation center. All of their belongings were kept in storage or thrown away. They could keep only what they could carry. Kids weren't shown any different treatment, as the camps held around 17,000 children under the age of 10. The most shocking piece, in my opinion, is that by the time all the Japanese Americans were rounded up, over 100,000 were in confinement, and of those, less than 250 were spying for Japan, meaning 99% of the citizens that were jailed were innocent. For days, Japanese Americans were stuck on buses and trains, trying to reach the nearest relocation center for monitored temporary housing, a few months at most. Unfortunately, unfit for human living. These centers were located in remote areas, often reconfigured fairgrounds and racetracks, with buildings not meant for human habitation. Conditions included thousands of people sleeping in horse stalls or cow sheds. There always seemed to be food shortages and substandard sanitation. Eventually, everyone would be hauled into the easiest mode of transportation, headed to an internment camp. These were no party either. Converted racetracks and barbed wire fences were nothing less than a nightmare. Bullets stormed down like hail from guard towers for simply getting too close to the fencing. Men and women being shot at and killed for no good reason. Tear gas was thrown at crowds by police forces, causing commotion and multiple reported deaths. From the start, violence and discomfort was given to the prisoners, and to make matters worse, there were crowding issues everywhere. In the provided homes, multiple families were expected to live in one room, barely enough space for 3 people to live comfortably. The rooms had little to no insulation for cold weather and poor ventilation in the heat. Typhoid, dysentery, and smallpox spread across the camp in no time. Next, there were the dining halls. Too many people crammed at the same time. To eat, there were no options. Rice, vegetables, and bread, day after day. And even if these things sound appealing, they certainly were not. The portions weren't filling and popularly described as disgusting. Food poisoning and other similar illnesses resulted this. Nearly everything about the camps were tragic and heartbreaking. Most adult internees were given the opportunity to work. There was a significant range of jobs, from doctoring, cooking, serving, working in construction, or being a janitor. There was a job for almost anyone. Yes, this was a good thing, except the Japanese were only paid a fraction of what a Caucasian would be paid. The camps were unfair. Someone needed to put a stop to it. In 1942, 22-year-old Fred Korematsu refused to participate in the camps. He was arrested and sent to the San Francisco County Jail. 4 months later, he was convicted of defying a government order. At the time, he was only standing his ground. He had no idea he would be the triumphant leader for the Japanese in the future. After threats and months of jail time, Korematsu was persistent. He appealed his case and got to the Supreme Court. The first time around, the court ruled against him. After World War II ended, the Japanese Americans were freed, maybe from the camps, but not from the racism following their return to American society. For years, they lived uncomfortable. Korematsu kept his innocence, however, his U.S. Supreme Court conviction had an impact on his professional life. In 1983, Korematsu's case was reopened by pro bono attorneys. After being offered a pardon by the U.S. Justice Department, a close member of his family claimed that Fred was not interested in a pardon from the government. Instead, he always felt that it was the government who should seek a pardon from him and from Japanese Americans for the wrong that was committed. Later in the year, Korematsu's conviction was overturned. Even then, he wanted the government to admit that they were wrong. He fought for the government's word to never allow this to happen to any American citizen, no matter their race, creed, or color. He decided to become an active member of the National Coalition for Redress and Reparations, as well as human rights activist. He traveled to Washington, D.C., and helped process the official apology from the government to all of the surviving Japanese Americans that were in internment. Starting in 1988, President Reagan signed a Civil Liberties Act, which compensated over 100,000 people that were incarcerated in Japanese internment camps. This was a formal apology and $20,000 to every surviving victim. Internment was now described as a grave injustice, the money acting as a redress for their experiences. When Korematsu first went to court back in the 1940s, he wanted to receive proper justice. He did not want to wait 40 years for everyone to get their apology. In the end, he got what he asked for. Yet the experience of internment can never be forgotten. Nobody could ever take the awful memories from over 100,000 people. Imagine living for over 2 years, staring at a barbed wire fence, freedom right past the pricks and wire. Trying to get past it, however, would just be digging your own grave. Nothing could ever make it right. Not even the extreme amount of sympathy money. Studies show that the internees had a much greater risk of cardiovascular disease and traumatic stress. Following the release, many of the survivors lived the rest of their lives with low self-esteem and psychological trauma, making them feel like they're worthless because they were born with their culture. Thankfully, the American government promised to never again make internment camps for citizens and use them with the reasoning of race. For many years, the resolution stood triumphant. If only that promise was held to this day, and not being questioned once again. With new events going on, decisions need to be made. Sadly, some officials are pretending that the U.S. vs. Korematsu case does not matter. Internment is comparable to some aspects of the Holocaust, which went on at the same time. Today, plans for the Muslim immigration ban can be compared to the tragedy. History tends to repeat itself, and in this case, not for the better.